going to move on to Workforce Pell, which is of the week, topic of the week here. So I'll invite the panelists to come up to stage. I'm going to introduce Tom Weko, who's going to then moderate the panel. But Tom is a research professor at George Washington Institute of Public Policy. He's got a wealth of experience in higher ed policy, including leading the higher ed program at OECD and doing a lot of work at NCES, among other things. I think gainful employment might have been something he was a little bit involved in that he can draw from his experiences of as we navigate the waters now of Workforce Pell, especially with the rules coming out this week. Lots to talk about. So welcome the panel up to the stage and let Tom take over.
Do we have our, could we have our slide that explains to people the features of, there we go. Great. Good afternoon. So in the hour ahead, I'm going to moderate a panel, which means I'm going to shut up. And you're going to hear from people who actually know a huge amount about federal policy and all the way down to the ground, to the institutional level, about the challenge of designing and implementing Workforce Pell. So I'm going to assume you're already familiar with some of its broad features. If you're not, that's as much help as you're going to get today. Look at that. That is an overview of the key features. And for those of you who are avid readers, this morning, the Federal Register dropped 85 pages outlining the details of Workforce Pell. I confess I didn't read it this morning, but you'll have a chance to do that. In fact, it looks very much like what we had imagined it would look like, which is the way that the whole system is supposed to work. The final rule is supposed to look like what was negotiated. So we're going to hear from 4 experts deeply involved in the development and implementation of Workforce Pell. Rachel Stevens Parker is Executive Director of the Maryland Governor's Workforce Development Board. She actually sat and negotiated rulemaking and is now, for her sins, involved actually in taking this forward to actual delivery. We have Chad Knights, who's now the Chief Academic Officer and the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Northern Virginia Community College. And everybody knows NOVA, right? Seriously, raise your hand if you don't. It's one of the nation's larger and more innovative community colleges. And we have 2 people who have worked together. There are only 50 states in the United States, but both Iris Palmer, who's the Director for Community College Initiative at New America, and Corey Gheesling, who's Associate Vice President at SHEEO for Workforce Development. Both of them have been providing technical assistance and support to states. Each of them tell me, and I can't prove them wrong, that they've been working with about 30 states or so, aiding them in taking forward the implementation of Workforce Pell, which is really impressive. It apparently takes a village to implement Workforce Pell. So what I've asked them to do is to speak to, I've set for them 4 questions. Where are states and institutions today as you prepare to launch Workforce Pell? What are the problems you face, the challenges you faced in getting to this point? So I've asked them to speak just to that for 5 minutes or so, each of them from their own experience, and those are different experiences. And then we're going to go to a free-for-all, no kicking or pulling hair, but a free-for-all discussion among our panelists in which they address 2 other questions, which is, what problems do you see in the year ahead in bringing this to life? And what are the most important and enduring impacts of Workforce Pell? Because it is, in some senses, a really fundamental shift in how we think about and do educational workforce policy. So I'd be interested for your reflections on sort of what the impact of this is going to look like as we go forward. So without further ado, I'll randomly choose people. I guess we'll just go from left to right, if that's okay. Rachel, you just arrived a few seconds ago. If you've caught your breath, I thought...
Barely, but yes, I think I'm ready.
So where are you today?
Yeah.
And how was it trying to get here?
Whew. Catching my breath on a lot of levels, I'll say, is a good way to summarize it. So as mentioned, I lead our Governor's Workforce Development Board in Maryland. In Maryland, we serve a central strategic coordinating function and a number of kind of cross-agency, cross-sector education workforce efforts, and of course serve as our state's designated state workforce development board in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act system. And so, being at the table for Workforce Pell negotiated rulemaking did feel like I had a little bit of a front row seat and a little bit of a head start and starting to dissect all the many. This slide, by the way, is so good. Whoever made it, I want to like steal this graphic.
Federal
It's
Student
so-
Aid Agency, your government
I'm taking
doing
it.
excellent work,
I
as
am-
always.
I am taking it because, it's such a good way to explain something. It's so complex. And so in Maryland, we've gotten pretty far. We just closed public comment on our draft policy. And actually, I came from a meeting that ran a little bit long up in Baltimore, meeting with our team that administers our eligible training provider list, because that is the front door we are choosing to use. And once we got some things on paper and through public comment, we realized, wait, we got to hash out a lot of details, especially details that are going to mean improvements to that system and that process to support everything we need to do, including administering this process. I think the assistant secretary just kind of left off on a really great note on that front. But so kind of what it's looked like for us and some of the challenges in getting there, we started, even before negotiated rulemaking took place, convening, first landing who's the quarterback in the state. That was me. And so then once that was landed and, really kind of clear with our higher education partners, our workforce system partners, then we started immediately convening a cross-agency and local stakeholder working group. We had folks raise their hands to represent community colleges, local workforce boards, other types of providers to be with us on the journey along the way of dissecting the federal policy and developing our vision and what we want this to look like in Maryland. So kind of fast forward through to where we are now, processing comments on a policy. It's going to make what I think was already a really strong draft policy a lot better. And I'm really excited for that. I think in Maryland, we started this process and really leveraged this opportunity to do a lot of systems level thinking and designing that we had needed to do for a long time and just hadn't really done yet. So Maryland was one of the states that did not have a working functional definition of high wage or high skill or in demand. We didn't really have any of those. So this is our leverage point to create and align those definitions across systems and funding streams and really say what we mean as a state are our priorities. On some of these other definitions, meeting hiring requirements, what do we mean by employer validation? What have we seen work well in our state? What doesn't quite work as well? And we're now thinking about what we've done through Workforce Pell and how we apply that in other policy areas, like our eligible training provider list and how we raise the standards there. So we started really kind of like from ground zero in a lot of ways, despite my little bit of a head start as a state. We needed to really dig deep on some of these definitions, but now we're at a really good place, and we're looking at a July 1 launch in our state, given where the kind of launch date of our platform provider and when they'll have our platform up and running and starting to work with institutions. We're going to finalize the policy before then, and of course start working to ensure institutions, they're already well aware. We've been socializing this constantly along the way so that we have folks ready to submit some programs. As far as challenges, I talked a lot just now about working with a lot of partners, and you go further when you go together, but you don't go faster. We all know the idiom, and that's true in this work. And it's been tough, and the timelines are kind of forcing us to make some changes and really have hard conversations, maybe faster than some people, might normally be comfortable having them. I think on net that's going to be a good thing. I think it's also meant that one challenge for us has really been messaging the expectations. What is this? How can you hold together at the same time, thinking of this as kind of like a pilot? We're starting this quickly. We want to try something and hope that the definitions and process we're laying out can work in the long term. At the same time, we have to be ready to potentially iterate on this in a year as we learn what's working and what's not about our standards and the process by which we apply them. Holding that in the same breath as these bigger systems level conversations I just referenced, messaging that clearly and in a way that really kind of sinks in for our stakeholders, I think has been a challenge. And of course, working closely with many people in our administration and our state and with our governor's office, also keeping the messaging clear that Workforce Pell is not going to be a huge funding source, silver bullet to your workforce challenges on AI or federal worker displacement or fill in the blank. That's not what this is going to be, at least for a long time. Those have been a couple of the kind of big things for us.
Great, thanks very much. So Chad was not starting from ground zero. No, I mean, because you're in Virginia. Yeah. And so I think it's interesting to share kind of your experience, kind of where you are, and kind of, in a sense, the head start you had by virtue of the experience of Virginia.
Yeah, no, sure. I appreciate that. The word iterative sticks in my mind in thinking about through this. So I'll answer one question up front first. You might be asking why a chief academic officer is here as a CAO. Prior to this work, my role was overseeing the IT and engineering technology programs at the college, which really involved, as you might imagine, the IT pathways, but also semiconductor, data center operations, fiber cabling trades. So it really had a span where I was really collaborating very closely with our VP for research strategy and workforce innovation, and really develop that back and forth that you hope to be able to see over time, where a student doesn't actually recognize necessarily what the program is they're in. It gets them to the end goal that they're targeting. And so I'm really sitting in for Steve on this, but I think when you think about Virginia's position on this, we have, I think in 2016, we launched a program called FastForward across Virginia. And this was really a statewide initiative that was focused on helping to scale credentials that were connected to high-wage, high-demand fields. Since the launch of that program in 2016, we've awarded 80,000 or more of those credentials across the state, but along the way have also built up that pathway where you go from partner, employer, and college sort of approval and recognition of demand to our state board for the approval mechanism. And I won't speak for my colleagues in the state office, but I know they're working on modeling that to match the needs now for Workforce Pell. I think that the challenge that we've encountered, if you think about this in terms of the program scale, is that when the regulations came out, first what we've seen on the screen, and we matched it against many of the programs that we saw in FastForward, it was only a handful that would have actually qualified in their original state. And so trying to think about how you then take those established programs that you know are only 40 hours and offered in essentially 6 weeks, which is represented by an industry-approved standard, and trying to figure out a way to make them work within a model around the Workforce Pell guidelines is sort of really where the work has come in to think about how do you then crosswalk this from an existing program now into sort of to take advantage of the Workforce Pell space. And so I think the three areas, while we have an advantage in the space because we have had success with FastForward, and I think the other piece that's important to notice around these kinds of programs, FastForward itself isn't just around aligning it, and I'm sorry if I got ahead of myself, it's not just around aligning it to recognize that the credential is high demand and leads to high wage. It's also essentially a paid performance model where the student pays for the first third of the course. You then have the state that pays for the second third, which is then covered if they complete the course, and they pay for the final third if in fact they earn the industry credential. And then there's also their financial means that help to buy down that first third that was on the student. So it actually was a state-based financial grant program to help students work through non-credit programming. And so it does have a lot of mirroring aspects to Workforce Pell in that space. But I would say, besides that piece around the alignment with the leveraging that existing FastForward framework, the other piece that we have is you have to think about some of the systems that we use at the college that actually puts this in play, the operational elements and the logistics of how you actually award aid. So most of the programs that we have right now are state-based. This is now federal funding. While everything is audited, everything is accounted for, there's definitely a background here in terms of understanding. We manage our systems of the students in the registration process for workforce programs versus our credit programs differently, and trying to then align them to make sure that when you start awarding that Workforce Pell, you don't flood your financial aid office with challenges where they're coming after you. And so that's one of the pieces on the back end that was a little bit blind to us when we first started to work through this in terms of making sure that the systems could actually keep up with that model. And then again, the piece around the alignment is another, I think, one of the challenges that we have when you think about the timing of the program, right? So you're thinking about not just length, but also the content to make sure that you're able to bundle it in an effective portions to make sure that it still qualifies under, I think, what our guidelines were for how you want to invest in the Workforce Pell model. But I do think that as you look forward and you think about how these are going to roll out, I think when you're not, to your point, it's going to be, you're not going to see a launch of 50 programs, right, come July 1. You're going to see 3 to 5 from an institution that you'll put out there that you're going to iterate on through to see how it matches, how the students respond, how your aid office handles the load, right, and how the students respond in that environment versus the existing models that you have. And so while I'd say Virginia might have had an advanced sort of edge in the model around the approval process going essentially to the state governing board, I think we're in the same boat with everybody else in trying to model these programs around these requirements. I'd also say that's also something that we've even seen within the state. And so if you think about it a little bit more on the ground level, especially if you start thinking about medical programs and clinicals, right? There's a very specific rhythm and timing that happens with those kinds of programs. And so we actually have one of the colleges within the Virginia Community College system that earned a FIPSI grant with the specific intention of redesigning the CNA and the CMA programs with VCU Health to try and better align it to match to Workforce Pell. Right, and those are the kinds of initiatives that I think you're going to probably see in the next year to try and help work through some of these challenges around how you take existing programs to map them into what the state, to what our requirements are.
Thanks very much. That's really great to hear. Sort of some of the ground level issues.
Yeah.
And Iris, I mean, when we talked, I was shocked because you have the sort of the state, this giant panorama of what's happening in the states, and it's so incredibly variable. And I'd love to hear a bit more about.
Yes, exactly, Tom. Thank you. So I want to take it up to like the 50,000-foot view and to say that both Nova and Maryland are like high achievers in this space. So unless somebody has information I don't, and if you do, please let me know. There are 5 states that have released public processes for their Workforce Pell approval programs so far, either in draft form for comment like Maryland or in final processes like Iowa and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
That's not very many. July is not very far away. I think what we're seeing right now is that states are working through these questions that are up here on the board and how to define those. And they're doing that in a very slow and deliberate process, which is how states are supposed to work. And I think a good number of states will not be ready by July 1, which of course makes the number of programs even lower than they would otherwise be. And to be honest with you, just because you can offer it in July 1 does not mean you have to. These are going to be short programs. We don't know how long the Department of Education's approval process will look like, but most likely as states get these processes up and running, you're going to be able to do that past the July 1 deadline. So this is going to be ongoing, is what I'm saying. Most states are working through these Workforce Pell task forces to define some of these parameters and to tell institutions how they can apply to get their programs approved for Workforce Pell. This is just really, really complicated in many, many ways. I'm not going to go into the weeds unless people want to, but basically just the way that we're defining each of these things and what they're asking institutions to produce to demonstrate that their programs meet these criteria is quite large. So it's not just the things the state has to determine, it's actually also the accountability measures that are on the bottom. States have to verify that they think the program will meet those accountability measures and that it's been running for a year. And so states are really struggling with that for lots of different reasons. They're struggling with it because they don't have the data. They don't have the non-credit data. They don't have the labor market outcome data, the job placement data. They certainly don't have the enhanced wage record, which tells you which occupation the student goes into. So it has been a challenge. It's also been a governance challenge. I think Rachel touched on this. These are really conversations across many different state agencies, and there's lots of stakeholders involved. And so getting those conversations going and doing them correctly is a huge challenge for states. At the institutional level, we've heard really similar things basically with every institution I've talked to, which is not very many of my programs are currently eligible, if any. I don't know that I feel really confident about the accountability measures that are going to be applied to my programs that might actually be eligible because of the length. And so I need to go back to the drawing board and rethink either how to change my existing programs to make them eligible or start new programs that might be eligible for this funding. And this is hard because of a lot of the things you mentioned, which are financial aid offices don't know how to deal with clock hour programs. In fact, we talked with an institution from Mott, from Michigan, who was saying that because they participated in the experimental site around clock hours, they felt like their financial aid office was like miles ahead of others. And I think that's probably true. So that's just one piece. There's the basically the fact that the data from the non-credit side does not touch the data from the credit side. That's obviously not connected. We have lots of capacity issues around just generating some of the things you're going to need to do to have the accountability and to tell the state what they need to know to go through this process at the institutional level. So all of that is to say, we're not in a place where there's going to be hundreds of programs, and the challenges getting there, I think, are numerous, and hopefully I outlined some of them, and Corey can add more detail.
So, what does it look like from the SHEEO perspective, Corey?
Yeah, thanks, Iris. I just defer to Iris on. So if you're not familiar with SHEEO, every single state has a lead state higher education agency, and we're the membership organization that supports them. And so you may ask, why is somebody from a state higher education agency on this panel when they are not part of the statute for Workforce Pell? And that's one of the many reasons is because, as you see on this slide here, 7 of those 10 data elements, a lot of those live at the SHEEO offices in states. And so most of the states, as they're going about working in this process, started at the folks like Rachel's agency or out of the governor's office, and very quickly realized that they needed to bring in the SHEEO side of the house because of whether it's subject matter expertise, whether it's data, whether it's just program approval. There's a litany of existing work at SHEEO offices around the country that supports Workforce Pell. And frankly, also because of some of the other legislative actions within OB3, Workforce Pell wasn't necessarily top of mind for many state workforce agencies around the country, whereas all the institutions that are Title IV eligible are governed by your state higher education agency. So those existing relationships, those networks, those engagements with financial aid, student services, programmatic folks, all those exist at the SHEEO office. And so all that is to say, we exist in time and through time, right? Like everything that happens here. The Workforce Pell might seem like this huge jolt to the system. And really, in a lot of ways, states have really been developing the enabling conditions for Workforce Pell to be brought forth for a long time. Iris mentioned the experimental site work that's been going on, the P20W SLDS work that's been going on for 15, 20 years in states. States have been slowly and meticulously patching together administrative data and interagency relationships for a long time. Towards the end of the 2010s, we've really kind of entered into a modern era of economic development in states where more unified approaches to talent development, as Nick was saying earlier, has become the coin of the realm. In states that are good about it, they are a lot more competitive in large-scale economic development competitions. And so a lot of these relationships already exist, to the point that there are many states are having interagency statewide task force, either through governors-led initiatives or through statutory efforts that are formally tying these folks together, in which they're putting Workforce Pell kind of within the operation of these interagency groups that exist. So states are staggered. As Iris mentioned, 5 is what we're hearing. 2, Iowa is very, very proud to be first on the application side of it. Pennsylvania came out with great guidance and frameworks for how they were going to look at eligibility. North Carolina has been really active on working with institutional readiness in their community college sector in a way that was well out ahead of other folks. And then we just had a pretty, all of us were at a convening a few weeks ago, the NGA put on for Workforce Pell, and we have states that are just coming to the party for the first time. And that's for a variety of reasons. Formalized rules just came out today, right? There is an abnormal amount of governor's races this fall. So many states are just kind of like, we're going to let the next administration decide how they're going to do this as well. So all I say is it's staggered, but we're seeing a lot of progress happening as well. On the challenges side of it, for us, as Iris mentioned, governance has been a massive one. You heard my preamble to this. Necessary parties were not involved in both the formal legislation, but in the rulemaking process, even though they were providing significant guidance to the rulemakers on how to do this, right? And so that led to an environment at the state level where it really was kind of that classic Spider-Man cartoon where everybody's pointing at each other, not wanting to move first. That was the first few months after OB3. Like, nobody really wanted to take the hard leadership on it right away. And so that has delayed implementation to an extent. But once they got through that and people decided who was going to be on first, then it became an administrative and data challenge in many states. Is what are the assets that we currently exist? What does not exist? How do we get the things that don't exist? And it's really ushered in this conversation around enhanced wage records and how do we make this happen at the state level, which obviously brings statutory changes and all across the country. And we're also kind of in this phase too of beginning to look at how are we going to give this information to learners? As you heard Nick talk about earlier, a big priority for our folks and our members are how do we ensure that students have the accurate information that they need to make the right decision for their next step, right? And we can be a little agnostic. Obviously, we're going to push higher education as much as possible, but the reality is that might not be the best next step for every individual. But who the individual encounters, whether it's at a job center, at their chamber of commerce, at the postsecondary enrollment office, that's going to largely dictate their path. And how do we bring some kind of coherency to this? And that's really where I think a lot of state officials are starting to think through how they can have a kind of a generalized front door for learners in their state and what kind of help them in this journey.
So what I'd like to do for everybody grab a microphone. What I'd like you to do is, what's the most difficult thing facing you anticipate sort of in the year ahead, or the states with which you're working? Turn your chairs towards one another. Let's make this a group exercise. And I'd like you to just kind of share with one another, like, this is I think really going to be the hardest thing for us to work through in the next 6 to 12 months. Around to that.
You have a lot of senses.
I don't have to go first, but I can. I'm trying to pick which one thing I'm going to say.
Which one matters?
Which keeps you up at night?
Getting it done, period. The process integration that we have to do and the way that, and we are trying to do it really well is the other thing. Like, we're trying to do an excellent job. We're not trying to phone it in. And you mentioned some state variation. And I think you were very kind about it. I will say I think some states are also going to do it and phone it in. At least for a little while. And we're trying not to do that. And I'm so proud of that. It also makes it harder. And we're doing this in an environment where budgets are tight, capacity is already beyond maxed out for every office that we work with, every partner that we have who is supporting us in this work and partnering with us. And this is a thing for Maryland. I say us. I mean, this is a Maryland opportunity, right? It's for every state. It's an opportunity for the state. And so we've had to really break down the walls of who's owning what and how do I feel about it. But so when I think about what's next, it's the capacity needed to get it done, and the fact that we got a little bit of support in our state legislature this past session, and we're figuring out which partners need what out of this little pot of $300,000 to make this happen. I think we're one of the only ones, and so a lot of states are also going to be figuring out just how to implement the process that they, as you're figuring out the right process, what can we implement is a really big challenge, and so that's something we're working through. Like I said, right before I got here in real time.
And Chad, at the institutional level, like how are you finding that sort of the bodies and the money and the sort of capacity to take this forward? Because that's,
Well, it's definitely a challenge, and I think we were just chatting about it. I think the piece around data access has some limitations for us right now in terms of placement UI data, the access that you're going to need to actually demonstrate the necessary earnings to then validate the credential that you're offering. And I think, and the challenge we have is that we currently have it, like Virginia's specific challenge, we currently have a model where that works. And so I think it might even slow our movement into the Workforce Pell model more until we feel more confident that we can take that approach and then see the data that we need to validate the placements and get that feedback. I think the other part too that, and I'll put maybe a little bit of the academic hat on, there is going to be immense pressure on the credit side of the house in the coming years because of the earning premiums applied to credit degrees. And so what you're going to find is that when you start talking about portability, right, portability is something that I think Nova does exceptionally well. We have credit for prior learning across the board for almost every applied program that we offer. I think a trick we have, though, is that I've never really thought about why would I need to take a welding credential and take that and move it into a higher ed credential, like into an accredit. So I think those pathways exist, but as you see more and more pressure put on the credit side, you might see more restrictions or resistance around that portability piece because they're going to want to keep the base in the credit side. And what I don't want to see is a harder divide created between what is credit and workforce that I think we've all been working for to sort of bridge together to see it as one opportunity for the student, and no matter what it is, it's what they need to basically make that career jump. And so I think that is a piece that I'm a little bit concerned about in the next, I'd say, couple oncoming years.
So I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, but I think being able to implement the enhanced wage records at the state level in the timeline that was laid out is not necessarily realistic. I think it's going to have to get revisited. I think that's also one of the biggest opportunities connected to Workforce Pell.
Do you want to define enhanced wage records?
Yes. I mean, I think this group probably knows. But so basically, we have our unemployment wage record system that's run through the states. And mostly now it just says where somebody is employed and how much money they make by quarter, right? And what an enhanced wage record is, will add a bunch of, will add new information. And most importantly for this conversation, would add what occupation that person is working in, right? So if I graduate with a CNA and I'm working as like a janitor at a hospital, I can look like I'm actually employed in my field, but I'm not employed in my field. So this would clarify that, and the requirement that is in the rule right now is that states would be able to say who is employed in occupation as part of this placement rate. And I think right now, even with 5 years out, I think is in the rule, that's still incredibly ambitious, and that's a big challenge.
Before I came to SHEEO, I worked in a state that passed enhanced wage records. It's a minimum of a 3-year change management process and tens of millions of dollars attached to it. To put an exclamation point on Iris's point there.
Share my opinion about the biggest challenges.
I mean, I think that there's different challenges for different levels, right? Like the folks in this room understand a lot of the complexity in the non-credit space. Imagine that, we just kick that rock open for the entirety of state government to recognize, and like that, there's lots of fires being put out across the country right now in terms of recognizing that, wait, this is on a Google sheet, right? Kind of data. So different levels have different problems, right? I think at the state level, this is a expansion of a Title IV program that is using WIOA rules, right? These are different languages being spoken by the people that are trying to set the overall frameworks in the state. And there, frankly, hasn't been enough time that these folks have been in the room together across the country. Just deliberate decisions are being made. And I think the thing that keeps me up at night is there are some moral hazards with this, right? Like this turns on July 1. A learner's going to be given advice on to enroll in a program, and it may be a terrible decision for them in the long term because they've exhausted their Pell eligibility, right? And we have to get this right. And it's getting it right for the student. It's also making sure these programs are continuing to be of high quality. We know the data, it makes sense. The more education you have on average, like the better opportunities you're probably going to have. So it makes sense that short-term programs, there's improvement to be made there. I think that states are really trying to invest some time in thinking, how can these truly be high quality learning experiences for individuals to help meet kind of the federal objectives, but also meet the learner where they're at in a highly volatile economic marketplace they're in.
So going through our murderer's row one more time. What do you think, what do you anticipate, or what do you hope will be some of the long-term impacts? Because I think everybody's been very clear that, we should not expect tens of thousands of programs rolling out in a hurry. But it sounds as if there are some sort of deeper changes that this is driving at the state and the institutional level. What do you see the sort of a long-term impact of this being for the education and training system or the institutions?
No, that's a great question. I think that's where so much of the opportunity is. So I'll speak kind of systems level versus institutional level, kind of from my perspective. I think one is, we've talked about the data modernization just now. I think that's huge. It's been like the North Star for so long. And when I read the draft regulations, I said, I see what you did there. In terms of applying the law to like kind of really push states like, okay, if you want, no one wants to say they're not going to do Workforce Pell, period. You're going to have to make some moves here. We're lucky in Maryland. We are starting off with actually not ground zero on data, maybe in some of the other definitional and policy places, but not on data. And so I think taking it to the next level with enhanced wage records is going to be a huge thing for our ability to assess performance across all types of education and training, and what are they really preparing people for. Even being able to articulate, by the way, the value not just of workforce training programs, but also of, 4-year degrees. I mean, wouldn't that be something interesting to see, right? What's the data like for different types of 4-year degrees and where people are going with them, and how can you let that translate value? So I think that's a really going to be a really big deal. From a governance perspective, I also think, and I mentioned this at NGA a couple weeks ago, I think a lot of states right now are grappling with questions about how do we better unify our economic and workforce and talent strategies? And within that, our education and workforce systems. What does that governance model look like? Who does what within that governance model? And really, where does the rubber meet the road on those roles and responsibilities? And it's really hard, I have found in my 2.5 years in this role, to have that conversation in the abstract. It's much more easy to have when there's a tangible example and you're working through it in real time. And then maybe on the other side, you say, look, this makes sense. This is working. This applies elsewhere. So I think that's also a real opportunity when we think about what is the ideal job of a state workforce board. And Maryland's much closer to, I think, to the ideal job than what a lot of state workforce boards out there are doing right now when they meet 4 times a year. We're not 100% there, I'll admit it, but I think we're a lot closer, and it put us in a good position for this. But what's the ideal job of a state workforce board, of their agency partners, and all these things? So I think the governance piece long term, I think that where you make those decisions ultimately, through things like employer validation and real industry alignment, does funnel down into how programs have an impact on the ground. So I think that's something I'm really excited for long term. Then the last thing I'll just say is on actual training quality, it's pushing conversations to happen much more quickly in our own state about existing approval processes and lists that we have that we put money behind or let individuals sign up for. And is having just some considerations that have pretty low bars, 33% completion rate consideration for a program to be on our EGPL. Oh, maybe that's not a high enough bar, right? I mean, kind of no kidding. We've known that, didn't need this exercise to know that, but it is pushing a very reasonable conversation about, well, wait, should we revisit some of these standards? And then how can we support all types of providers in reaching that standard? Because that really, is a high standard of delivery that we should want to hit.
That's great. How about at Nova?
Yeah, so
What impact?
it's on here, yeah. So I think I see it as a major opportunity for our students, right, for the learners that are in the program. And I hope I don't get ahead of myself, but we've been, right, at an institutional level, we've been working for a one-door sort of access to our programs for a very long time, where a student doesn't have to necessarily recognize whether or not it's a workforce program or a credit program. They simply see a career opportunity or the opportunity that they need to achieve, and they're able to then be successful in that. And right now, we clearly have a credit door, and then we have workforce door. And while we in disciplines and programs have been able to break that down, I think one of the challenges that we'll have going forward, and this has at least been my experience, I've had the opportunity to build 3 to 5 new programs at the college, and done so hand in hand with workforce, where my faculty don't see a difference. They see one program at the college that's offered in multiple different forms. But if you have existing programs that have been developed in sort of their own silo, trying to unify them in the eyes of an employer or in the eyes of a model like this, where you're talking about a new entry point for students where you want to see them cross over easily, it becomes more challenging, right? They're rooted a little bit more in the historic context of what they're doing. And so I think that's the opportunity for us, though, I think, with this kind of a model, is to now offer this in these short-term credentials for students that typically would have only seen a credit path. And the other part of that is that we often built programs that belonged in workforce in the credit model because they were Pell eligible, right? So we have an HVAC program that's Pell eligible. That should be a workforce targeted program. And I think trying to now flip that switch to move us into this space where the funding model now supports more effectively a workforce format than what we currently have is going to be the opportunity for us, but it's a double-edged sword. It's also a challenge because of the existing structures that we'll have to work through as we put that implementation in place.
What are the advantages of moving HVAC?
The shorter turnaround time. The shorter turnaround time for our graduates, right? So right now you're taking 15-week courses for something that I know I could probably condense and offer you in a full-time format in more of a 6-week or more frequent start and stop times. You could also then model the curriculum a little bit more targeted into certain industries. And this one is very front of mind for us because this is probably one of the largest demands within Northern Virginia when you look at the data center market, the commercial space, as well as the power space. Or even federal space, right? Federal uses a specific system for their building moderation and control. You could build a program that's specifically targeted at that where you have a difficult time doing that in a credit program that is more sort of holistic in terms of its model. But trying to get, I don't know, dirty laundry, right? Trying to get my teams to play nicely in that space right now has been a bit of a struggle, right? And I think trying to bring us forward where you can have those kinds of programs that operate, they see themselves holistically as one opportunity for the student, I think is something that will, like, moving forward is really a pressure point that I think Workforce Pell helps to put a little bit more incentive for us to come together as that one group in
Thank
one
you for
program.
mentioning students. That's great.
Yeah.
Iris?
Whoops, there we go. To build on that a little bit, I will say I think it is much easier to administer programs in Pell and the 4-credit side than it is trying to fit things into Workforce Pell, which is what I tell people who ask about apprenticeship in this space. I say, how about you just offer your apprenticeship on the 4-credit side and then it's Pell eligible? And that's so much easier than trying to make it fit into this format that does not fit. But as far as the things that I think are really exciting about this, one is actually aligning our state approval processes a little bit better, not only for ETPL, but actually for academic programs too. Like so many academic programs on the credit side, and even sometimes on the non-credit side, although less so, have to go through multiple levels of program approval at their institution, at the state, at the system. Like, it is a lot. And none of it is that useful to the people and the practitioners and the students who are going to be taking these programs.
Absolutely.
So perhaps, and here's a thought, we could use this process to kind of help rethink some of those and actually align them to what is required in this, and also think about it more from the practitioner, the student, and the quality level.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I think would be amazing, and I hope people are thinking about that. I do know some states we've talked to are thinking about that. I think that I've already talked enough about enhanced wage records, but I will say improving the non-credit data infrastructure at states could be an incredible benefit from this, as would articulation data. So understanding how students move through the system and whether or not they actually stack the pathways that are designed to stack. Thank you, Lindsay, for all your amazing research on this, but there's not enough, and it would be great if our policymakers and practitioners knew how their students actually move through the system. On the college level, I think understanding that articulation would be huge, better. Also, being able to use labor market outcome data would be amazing, actually getting that back from the states. And then also really leveraging this to improve that non-credit to credit transition and to rethink sort of the role of non-credit in institutions as sort of the experimental side of the institution that's more responsive to some of those labor market demands, but then also thinking about the role of credit and what that means. So Steve was at a dinner I was at, Steve Partridge was at a dinner I was at recently, who also works at Nova on the workforce side, and he said that's how you think about it at Nova, and I think that's really wonderful, and I think this could be used to leverage that opportunity into better systems to do this at institutions, because leaders can say, oh, now the federal government's requiring us to do it. Sorry, everybody, you have to come to the table. So hopefully it doesn't make it worse, because that had not occurred to me, but hopefully it does make it better.
Likewise, Workforce Pell is a leveraging moment that you can use to bring stakeholders that have maybe been a little resistant across the state and local communities to the table to have some of these really intentional conversations. I think ultimately one of the things that I'm really excited about is it's allowing us as a field in this learning space, right? Whether it's post-secondary education, whether it's workforce development, job training, fill in the blank, to really step back and say, what is the future end game that we're trying to have, right? And who is it for? And how can we design this system so that it benefits that individual? As you just heard Nick talk about, like, in the end, they're going to be making a critical life choice at 3 a.m. when they've realized that they're tired of crawling under houses and they want to maybe expand, start their own business, get new skill sets, new training certifications. They're going to pull out their phone and they're going to start doing some research, right? How can this information be usable for that individual so they can make a great choice, understand how to pay for it, how long it's going to take, can they keep working while they're doing it, or do they need to go full time? And it's also, I think, for our sector within the post-secondary space, bringing a lot of just humanity to a segment of our institutions that has been woefully underserved by, I think, traditional academic leadership, right? A lot of these folks are serving as enrollment officers in the continuing professional education space, are serving as enrollment officers, as their kind of own CAO in many cases, as their data warehouse. I mean, this is an opportunity to start providing resources and really thinking through intentional ways that these can be integrated throughout the process. And as Ira said, our members are some of these folks that they make the determinations on how programs get approved. It is not necessarily easy, but it is very much within the wheelhouse of state higher education agencies to say, you're just not going to get a program approved if you're not going to have Workforce Pell articulation. That can happen, right? So there is a future state here that I think it's providing policymakers a really unique time to take a step back and think through some of these questions. I saw Martin Kurzweil over there, just like credit mobility, I think is a massive, massive opportunity that we have to really validate the learning of individuals, meeting them where they're at, bringing it to the table, giving them credit where credit's due. We already know how to do this, and it's about scaling that work, right? And I think this is an opportunity that we can do it.
We have time for about 3 incredibly insightful, concise questions among people who have not yet had a chance to ask a question. Roy, sorry, I'll come back, but I want to spread the wealth here. Please.
Mine's going to be controversial.
No, please.
Hello, I'm Lindsay from RAND, and I was wondering, a lot of states already have short-term credential funding financial aid programs in place. What advice would you give to these states about how they should be thinking about, should they get rid of their state financial aid programs? Are you afraid they're going to get rid of their state financial aid programs? And then how should they be thinking about, using both of these along with each other?
So I wrote a piece on this based on some of the scan that Stephanie and HCM did, but also adding to that for some there's actually a lot of states that have financial aid programs that only target programs that are in sort of this band, either non-credit or short-term programs that were previously ineligible for Pell. And in that, I recommend that, just to be clear, this is A, not a ton of money once it's prorated, and B, it only goes to students that are Pell eligible, right? So I thought that perhaps states could be thinking about adding additional funding to this to really prioritize the occupations that they see need more workforce development, and then also using those programs to start to plug the holes that you're going to see with Workforce Pell. So maybe topping up to reach the full cost, or thinking about full cost of attendance, I should say, or targeting students that maybe aren't as Pell eligible, so they have much less funding for this. I mean, that would not normally be a recommendation I would make, to be clear. I'd like money to go to people who need it the most. But I do think that is an option in this particular space and could be really powerful. The other thing I'll just say is that Louisiana, for instance, is actually using their approval process for their aid program that targets non-credit workforce programs to actually also approve their Workforce Pell program. So that's a really interesting way to align them. But many states actually are not currently aligned and actually need to make legislative changes to their short-term or non-credit aid programs so that they actually align and connect to Workforce Pell. One of those is New York State, and then also I believe Nebraska, and there's probably others that I don't know about, but just another flag that it's actually a really important thing that states need to do to make sure that institutions can provide the full amount of aid to students that are eligible.
There was another question over here.
Thanks. Kendler with ESG. My question is for Rachel. You mentioned going through the ETPL as the front door. I know that North Carolina's taken that approach. Michigan's taken that approach. Other states have voiced maybe that's another, bureaucracy or barrier to entry. What would you respond to your colleagues for why you're taking that approach specifically?
A great question and a really valid concern. And we struggled with that concern even in thinking about it for ourselves. We saw more benefits than harm, and we saw an opportunity to improve the bureaucracy of the process as it currently existed for us. And so we're working through the process of what the changes to the Maryland process will look like right now, so that maybe this becomes kind of one process as opposed to two distinct ones, leveraging that front door. But for us, so one, I think it's forcing some of that, like, how do we start to streamline some processes, forcing that conversation, and improve processes that already existed in addition to the standards that those processes apply. But the benefits we saw included a few things. One, for Pell eligible, WIOA eligible funding recipients, the ability to braid resources to support students, given some of these issues we were just speaking about, the ability to bring more high quality program providers who previously might not have seen the juice being worth the squeeze if there, it's a couple students on, individualized training accounts taking my program, and I've got to report all my performance data in order to get that. Well, now you also have to report it all for Workforce Pell anyway. And then the third piece we saw as a benefit was, especially knowing programs have to be in existence a year and tracking, reporting those outcomes for a year. And not every type of program that applies is currently captured in what we're very fortunate to have in our longitudinal data system and our non-credit program data. By being part of our ETPL, that data gets reported into a national system from which you can download completion and job placement data on the exact metrics we need to track for the first 3 years until we have enhanced wage records, if we get there in 3 years. And you can track it across state lines, the job placement, which for a lot of states, certainly a state like Maryland, is very important. That's a huge benefit. And so we saw a lot of benefits to that potential integration that made it worth working through. And frankly, we're still working through I really, truly just came from a meeting about like some of the weeds of, if we change this part of the process, it would actually make this better for the ETPL stuff. And it would also, and so we're really working through that in real time, but it's making us answer really good questions and solve problems there too. So I would say part of my answer would be there's those benefits, and maybe you don't have to feel burdened by your existing bureaucracy if you have a chance to maybe fix it.
Nice. Last question, Mark.
So I'm actually curious about the I spent a lot of time trying to.
Turn on the microphone.
Okay, I spent a lot of time trying to work with high school students, counselors, and trying to get the kind of information you're talking about. It's on, but it's not working. Could be a failure of technology. My technology, not that. So the question is, how do we get this information to the hands of high school students, right? Yeah. And we're pushing further and further down. We're having, CTE all over high schools. We're making people choose about pathways through high school. But I haven't seen one person here talk about like counseling high school students and about like careers and opportunities.
Yeah. This is top of mind for me, right? So throughout the rulemaking process, and Rachel, you could speak to this as well, right? There's a very clear priority from the current administration that WIOA, Perkins, and other state plans need to be one and the same. You see on the alignment description, high skill, high wage, or in-demand industry sector occupations. To get that at a state level is highly political. It can't just be a quantitative process, and it has to be inherently regional in focus as well. Which I'm explaining this because that trickles down into K-12 and how we're advising individuals, right? Students are making curricular decisions in elementary school, right? Like my elementary schoolers know what math and English they're going to be taking all throughout, right? So we pretty much know the pathway that they're taking. CTE in some states, right? Perkins 5 funds cannot be used for dual enrollment CTE courses. So how are we going to advise students within this really fragmented environment that's different from state to state? And so understanding how we can give accurate information to advisors who are overly stretched is a reason why I have white hair, right? Like, and not to like make it more difficult, right? But the types of jobs that are going to be available to those individuals, we know are either going to be highly different than they are right now, or they're going to be completely new, right? And so we have to really think through kind of how to understand this as a platform perspective to kind of get to where you need to go, and where does the different sources of state and federal funding move within this process to help you get there as well. Like an example I like to use is healthcare, right? If you want to be patient facing employee, at some point you're going to have to pass anatomy and physiology. So maybe the curricular decisions that we're encouraging that individual to take beginning in middle school are set up to help them pass anatomy and physiology, right? Instead of having this be a dead end that they get to at the 2-year institution if they're pursuing a ADN degree, for instance. So I think that there's a significant work that's going to happen as states take a look at the state talent plans, but then think through how funding works throughout the lifespan and where the appropriate places are. That needs to then inform the frontline individuals working with those students and their families so that they can do it well.
But how do we train counselors when this world is so rapidly changing, data systems that they need to access, right? And as you said earlier, they're overstretched, overworked.
Yeah.
But,
So-
and you said like at 3 o'clock in the morning, someone's turning on their phone. Yeah. Well, what are they accessing at 3 o'clock in the morning on their phone? And how do we make sure that that information is correct?
So I think, on the ground level that we have with this, so what we have found is that this, while we recognize it's a critical importance, it's not a priority, right? And when it's not a priority in that terms, it doesn't come with funding. And so what we've done is what you found is this is grant funded activity in almost all levels of how we've been able to build it. It's taken us about 5 years to build up based on multiple grants. It's a right in line for every grant about our ability to get into basically your junior high and high schools, recruit the students, bring them to the labs, bring in industry professionals, do externships with the counselors and advisors to actually bring them in and show them what it means to work at a semiconductor manufacturer, like a clean tech job. And it's amazed the wow you'll get out of those counselors and advisors. And so it might be a little out of context, but that's really how we've been able to accomplish this. Is it's really that externship of bringing those counselors and advisors in, as well as then giving them resources through those grants, whether or not it's people or the actual resources to support them, in terms of how we've been able to sort of engage. So someone actually knows what it is to work. They know what a bunny suit is, right? If you're going into a clean room. So I think helping them see that at an earlier age has definitely been, but it's almost all exclusively been grant funded work for us that we've had to do to try to leverage and build up that sort of system.
Yeah, and I would say most states have some kind of intermediary organization working in the kind of education, economic development space. For many states, this is kind of their off the books way that they can do industry recruitment, right? And so that they are largely really working with a lot of the K-12 officials around states to think through what are some of these qualifications and how do we need to start working with the advising community there. But I think that needs to be a lot more coupled relationship with the traditional policymaking bodies.
Michelle, I believe we're out of time. We're at time. Okay. Panel members, thank you. You've done a terrific job. Thank you, audience.